Yeah, it's hypocritical in so many ways. I mean, of course, we know that US politicians are very often hypocritical, but in the case of Trump, we saw that he claimed that he would be the peace candidate. He claimed in his inauguration speech that he was going to pursue peace, although he also claimed in his inauguration speech that he would expand the territory of the US, and he threatened to colonize the Panama Canal and other parts of the world, Greenland. So he's always had this very contradictory rhetoric. But here we are, and just 2 months in, Trump has massively escalated the US war on Yemen, the poorest country in West Asia. I just saw a tweet from CENTCOM, the US military central command, and they boasted that they're bombing Yemen 24/7. That's the language they used, 24/7. Trump also restarted this genocidal war in Gaza. Israel would not have taken this decision were it not given approval from the US. And it was reported by Trump administration officials that Trump personally gave the green light to Israel, to Netanyahu, to restart this war and to tear up the ceasefire that he helped to broker. Of course, right before he came into office, Trump told Netanyahu, who was a close personal friend, he said, you have to pause this war because you need to give me a reputational boost. As I come in as president, I want to portray myself as the peace president. And then now here we are 2 months later, and Trump said, go ahead, continue the genocide. By the way, it's not just my opinion. It's not just your opinion. This has been stated very clearly by multiple United Nations committees that this is a genocide. Multiple experts in international humanitarian law. There have, for instance, the United Nations, just a week ago, they published another report by one of these special committees. They often create these special committees that feature professors of international law and legal experts, and they come together and they study certain issues. And they've done this on Gaza, and they have repeatedly said this is a genocide. According to the legal international definition, the Genocide Convention, this meets the definition. And this is why South Africa introduced a lawsuit against Israel in the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide. And the justices, the judges at the ICJ, which is the top UN legal authority, ruled that Israel can be investigated on accusations of genocide, that there is a legitimate case to be made. And of course, many other countries in the global south have joined South Africa in this case, including many countries in Latin America, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Mexico have joined this case, several other countries in the global south. And of course, there's also this case in the International Criminal Court, although we see why people in Africa have long referred to the ICC as the International Caucasian Court, or I prefer International Colonial Court, because Netanyahu has an outstanding arrest warrant, and yet Netanyahu constantly is traveling to the U.S. He was just in the White House in Washington a few weeks ago, meeting with Trump. No consequences. Israel flew over French airspace, and the French government that claims to be a supporter of freedom and democracy, and they even claim to support the ICC, they did nothing. They allowed this wanted war criminal who's wanted by the ICC to go to the U.S. So what this really shows is that the ICC arrest warrant was marketing. I mean, I was always I hate to sound cynical, but I was always very skeptical about it. I knew they would not act on it, and now we see that. And furthermore, by the way, right after Trump came back into office, he put sanctions on the ICC. This didn't get a lot of attention because Trump literally signed hundreds of executive orders, and it's easy to get distracted by all of the crazy things that are happening. But, the Biden administration was threatening to put sanctions on the ICC. Trump put sanctions on the ICC, and here we are. And then, just a few days ago, the ICC arrested the former president of the Philippines, Duterte. And of course, this is obviously because Duterte was very friendly to China. The current leader of the Philippines is the son of the longtime dictator whose crimes were way worse than Duterte's crimes and never faced any consequences. Ferdinand Marcos Sr., he stole billions of dollars from the people of the Philippines. And now his son, with the same name, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos, is the president. No consequences. So what we see is that the ICC has made it clear there's a set of rules for certain countries, in the global south, of certain skin complexion, if they're dark-skinned, if they're white in the global north, no consequences. Netanyahu, who's an American, he had U.S. citizenship 2 times, spent most of his formative years growing up in the U.S., no consequences. So getting back to Trump, in terms of what's going on in Gaza and also Yemen. So in the case of Gaza, even the ceasefire was marketing. It was a cynical branding exercise, because different estimates showed, one of the estimates I saw is that Israel violated the ceasefire at least 900 times in the 2 months between January, when it was started, and now when it officially ended the ceasefire, by killing 400 Palestinians in one day, including well over 100 Palestinian children in one day. And so the ceasefire was only a one-sided ceasefire, which is often the case with Israel. When it signs a so-called ceasefire, they expect that the Palestinian side won't violate the ceasefire, but Israel can violate it hundreds of times with no consequences. In terms of Yemen, now the narrative that the Trump administration is using is that they have to attack Yemen because Yemen has been targeting ships in the Red Sea. However, Yemen has made it very clear. When we talk about Yemen, we're talking about the de facto government in the north of Yemen, where the majority of the Yemeni population lives, about 60% of the population. Not the puppet regime in the south, which is basically controlled by the US, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And is totally illegitimate and has an unelected government in the south of Yemen. In the north, where the majority of the population lives, there is a revolutionary nationalist government, which has a liberation theology, Islamist orientation, like Hezbollah, which is referred to as the so-called Houthis, but that's actually a derogatory term. That's not what they're called. They're called Ansar Allah, like Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're very similar. And the U.S. has this propaganda narrative claiming that supposedly Ansar Allah are Iranian proxies, which is completely BS. It's bogus. It's not true. Now, they're allies politically with Iran, like Hezbollah in Lebanon are allies with Iran, but they're not proxies. Ansar Allah, like Hezbollah, has its origins as an indigenous resistance movement in Yemen, just like Hezbollah emerged in Lebanon as a response to Israel's illegal military occupation of southern Lebanon in the 1980s. And Hezbollah was this militant organization that brought together a liberation theology view of Shia Islam, along with third world nationalism, global South nationalism. And they've even been influenced by some other revolutionary, even socialist movements. For instance, they were very very supportive of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. They spoke very highly of the Vietnamese Revolution and Ho Chi Minh. And if you read some of the late leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, he talked about how they modeled their guerrilla warfare activities after the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. That was one of their big influences. So I think the way I think of these groups is that there are these, what used to be called third world nationalism or global South nationalist movements, right? And in Yemen, it's very similar. In fact, the so-called Houthis, Ansar Allah, their ideological leadership, they have praised Hugo Chavez previously. And famously, they were interviewed by a journalist for PBS. They published a very interesting documentary about them. And they said, there's this narrative that the U.S. is spreading, trying to claim that we're Iranian proxies. This is part of their sectarian propaganda. We support Iran, but we're not their proxies. And they said, we are strongly supportive of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Why do they insist on calling us Iranian proxies? Because they're trying to create this sectarian narrative to justify this war against Yemen. And the war in Yemen did not just start now under Trump, of course. This goes back to Obama and then Trump's first term. And starting in 2014, going into 2015, they started a war on Yemen. And Saudi Arabia, with U.S. support, spent billions and billions and billions of dollars brutally bombing Yemen, the poorest country in West Asia, destroying civilian areas, devastating the country, killing hundreds of thousands of people, using hunger as a weapon, intentionally targeting food production sites to try to starve the Yemenis into submission. And they failed. And now what we saw is that, so the Ansar Allah has created a revolutionary government in what's referred to as the September 21st revolution, which is going back to 2014 when they had this revolution that overthrew an unelected, a fake elected leader who ran an election overseen by the U.S. in which there was no other candidate in Yemen. So, a U.S.-backed dictator, and the Yemeni people overthrew the illegitimate U.S. Saudi-backed regime. And Saudi Arabia in particular has a lot of influence in Yemen as kind of the proxy acting on behalf of the U.S. to exert control over Yemen. And so the Yemenis rose up and created this revolutionary government, influenced, yes, by the Iranian Revolution, but they're not proxies, they're allies. There's a big difference, right? And so the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and the UAE failed in this war after years of trying to destroy Yemen. And what happened when the Israeli regime started this genocide in Gaza? The Yemenis said, we are going to have humanitarian intervention. This is the responsibility to protect doctrine in order to stop the ongoing genocide because other countries are refusing to act. And the Yemenis said that any ships that are going to Israel, or eventually they also said that any ships from countries that are aiding Israel's genocide, we are going to intercept them and prevent them from materially supporting a genocide. They've allowed ships from other countries that are not participating in this genocide, like China, like Russia. So this idea from the U.S. that they're just attacking countries' ships in the Red Sea without any idea that it's just all just reckless, it's nonsense. It is humanitarian intervention. And this is really funny. It's actually very clever because the U.S. government has used this narrative and NATO has used this narrative for decades, claiming that they have to intervene in foreign countries because it's humanitarian intervention to stop genocide. This was, in the Biden administration, the head of USAID, and then in the Obama administration, a top State Department official was Samantha Power, who was also at the United Nations. Samantha Power, she made her entire career as the intellectual advocate for humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect doctrine. And here the Yemenis, for the first time, are actually trying to use a real humanitarian intervention, a real act of responsibility to protect, to stop an ongoing genocide, not this cynical excuse they use to try to overthrow a foreign government like NATO did in Libya in 2011. They said it was responsibility to protect based on lies. They overthrew the Libyan government, killed Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi. The British Parliament later published a report admitting that it was based on lies. Well, here we are. The Yemenis are taking brave actions, trying to stop this genocide, and the U.S. response is to bomb them 24/7. One other quick note on this. Now, the Yemenis, when Israel signed this so-called ceasefire brokered by the U.S., Yemen paused its operations in the Red Sea. And they said, okay, the genocide has stopped. Our operations in the Red Sea will stop. Because, again, they're not just recklessly attacking countries for no reason. It was part of an attempt to stop the genocide. When Israel announced that it was reinitiating the genocidal siege on Gaza to prevent all food and medicine and aid from going into Gaza, then Yemen reinitiated these operations to try to end the siege on Gaza, the genocidal siege, which violates international law. So it's actually Yemen that has been acting in a responsible way in support of human rights, whereas we see that the U.S. and Israel are doing the opposite of supporting human rights. They're committing genocide. And, of course, it's no surprise that Trump is continuing this. It was, of course, Joe Biden and the Democrats who oversaw this when it started in 2023. But it doesn't surprise me at all because when Trump was running for president, he gave speeches for pro-Israel groups. And he argued absurdly, insanely, Trump claimed that the Democrats were anti-Israel. And he famously, in his only debate with Joe Biden, when we saw that Biden's brain didn't work, in this debate, he's so crazy and so anti-Palestinian that Trump referred to Biden as a Palestinian, as an insult. Yep. And now he refers to Chuck Schumer, someone who, as a Palestinian. Chuck Schumer has never been pro-Palestinian in any way. He's only ever been pro-Israel. So, I mean, it's not surprising me at all, to me at all, that Trump is continuing this. But what it shows is that, the U.S. government is not a democracy. It is an empire, an imperialist authoritarian regime in which the only thing that the US government can do is wage nonstop war around the world. It is not a force for peace. It is not a force for human rights, and it never has been.
I believe Chuck Schumer just wrote a whole soliloquy about anti-Semitism targeting everybody who criticizes Israel. He's selling a book right now. So interesting that he's a Palestinian in Trump's eyes. It's absolutely ridiculous. But I wanted to ask you, Ben, about this particular component of Ansar Allah's humanitarian intervention, because it's exactly, I like how you put that, because they explicitly say this is an expression of them asserting the Geneva Convention. The Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, has said, this is a permanent war, that they're doing this to stop the attacks on shipping. Yet Ansar Allah intervened in the Red Sea before the genocide resumed in Gaza because of a blockade, explicitly because of the Gaza blockade. During the Biden administration, these missile strikes were actually quite troublesome. Israel now has the sirens back on every single day since the resumption of the genocide began. And U.S. aircraft carriers in the Red Sea and elsewhere, in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, are facing Yemeni hypersonic missiles seemingly every couple of days now. So what's your impression about this part of it? Because you mentioned the context of their resistance, but there's this element of the poorest people in the world using these incredibly advanced weapons to essentially assert the right to protect, which is supposedly the United States' number one doctrine, at least before Trump 2.0 decided to go isolationist ideologically. But for so long, this was the doctrine of the United States' empire. So what do you make of this military component of this resistance? It's quite astounding.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's amazing because it shows that the poorest country in the region is doing the most, after Iran, it's doing the most to actually support the Palestinians and to try to stop this genocide. So a few thoughts on this. First of all, let's keep in mind that Yemen is surrounded, it's the poorest country in West Asia. It's surrounded by some of the richest countries on earth that have not only done nothing to support the Palestinians, they're actually supporting Israel. So for instance, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, these are some of the world's largest oil and gas producers. They have some of the highest levels of GDP per capita on earth. They're just swimming in money. And instead of helping the Palestinians in any way, they're investing in Israel. And behind the scenes, we all know that they're supporting Israel. In fact, the UAE officially normalized relations with the Israeli regime. And Saudi Arabia was on the verge of normalizing relations with the Israeli regime. That's why the Palestinian resistance started this operation in the first place, is because they were saying that we're on the verge of being completely abandoned. The Saudis are going to normalize relations with the Israeli regime. This was following what Trump did. This, of course, has been the U.S. plan for decades. But during Trump's first term, he passed the Abraham Accords, in which the UAE and Bahrain normalized relations with the Israeli regime. And Saudi Arabia was always the prize. That's what the U.S. wanted. The Biden administration was also trying to pressure Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel and was not successful. Although there were reports that, for instance, that the Biden administration was offering the Saudis nuclear technology, which is very funny because we hear all this propaganda demonizing Iran for having a civilian nuclear program for nuclear energy. And the U.S. and Israel says they want nuclear weapons. And in the past, they didn't want nuclear weapons. There was never any evidence of that. But now the ultimate irony is that it would be logical for them to pursue nuclear weapons, considering that the U.S. and Israel are obviously hell-bent on attacking Iran. And Trump himself just tweeted out on his website, Truth Social. He truth out, stupidest term. He truthed out a threat to Iran. So Trump is now threatening war on Iran, which he famously said that Obama was stupid for threatening Iran. Well, I guess according to Trump's logic, he's also stupid. Anyway, the point is that, there's all this propaganda about Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. was offering Saudi Arabia nuclear technology, transfer of nuclear technology in return for normalizing relations with Israel. By the way, according to the Wall Street Journal, which reported on this, in the Biden administration, the U.S. had 3 demands for Saudi Arabia. And you can bet that the Trump administration is doing the same thing, and they probably have the same demands. Those 3 demands for Saudi Arabia normalizing with Israel is that, one, that the U.S. would provide security support and nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. Two, that Saudi Arabia must continue to sell its oil in dollars and only dollars. And three, that Saudi Arabia must limit its relations with China, break off all military relations with the Chinese military, between the Saudi and the Chinese militaries, and not allow China to build infrastructure in the region. According to the Wall Street Journal, those were the three conditions being negotiated. And then, of course, the Palestinian resistance started this response to Israel's genocidal blockade of Gaza, which has been going on for 15 years. And, they have, according to international law, the Palestinians have the right to armed resistance against illegal Israeli occupation. And the Israeli blockade of Gaza, going back now almost 20 years, that is considered an act of occupation according to international law. So the Palestinians had a right to armed resistance that has been reasserted in numerous United Nations General Assembly resolutions. Now, in terms of how the Gulf regimes are helping Israel, I already talked about how behind the scenes they're trying to normalize, but they're also investing in Israeli settlements. This has been reported by mainstream Western media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, which has a lot of sources in Saudi Arabia. And they reported that just right after Trump's first term ended in 2021, Trump's Middle East policy advisor, West Asia policy advisor, was Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, married to his daughter, Ivanka. And like Trump, Jared Kushner is a multimillionaire real estate developer. And so Kushner, right after Trump left office, Kushner created an investment company that invests very heavily in Israeli companies. So what happened? Right after the first Trump term ended, when Jared Kushner was working very closely with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris, right after he left office, the Saudi regime, the Emirati regime, and the Qatari regime, which all have sovereign wealth funds where these are oil and gas exporters. They get paid in a lot of dollars. They have a lot of excess dollars. They don't want to convert all of those to their local currencies because it would overvalue their currency. And that would make their exports less competitive and such. And it has negative repercussions for the economy. So instead, they invest those dollars in buy up different assets. So what happened? The UAE, the Saudi regime, and Qatar, they invested billions of dollars from their sovereign wealth funds in this investment fund created by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, based in Florida. And then what did Kushner's investment firm do with that money? It invested that money in Israeli companies that profit from Israeli settlements. In other terms, the Saudi regime, the Emirati regime, and the Qatari regime are profiting from Israeli colonization of Palestinian land. So not only have these regimes done nothing to help the Palestinians, they are directly complicit in the colonization of Palestinian land and the genocide against the Palestinian people. This is why the late and great Palestinian revolutionary leader, intellectual, Ghassan Kanafani, famously argued that it's not just the Israeli regime and Israeli colonialism that is the enemy of the Palestinian people, but also what he referred to as the reactionary Arab regimes, in particular the Gulf monarchies that have for decades collaborated with U.S. imperialism and helped the U.S. empire and the Israeli regime try to crush all of the resistance movements in West Asia. And over decades, those resistance movements have evolved in different ways, right? So, during the first Cold War, many of these resistance movements were led by communists. Like in the Palestinian case, there was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. They still exist, but they're not the largest Palestinian armed group today. And there were similar groups in other parts of the region. You also had revolutionary left-wing Arab nationalism, like Nasser in Egypt. You also had the rise of Baathism, which was a socialist Arab nationalist movement. And you had the more left-wing variety, which was in Syria, and the more right-wing variety that was in Iraq. But they were also committed to fighting against Israeli colonialism and supporting the struggle of the Arab peoples against Western colonialism. So after destroying all the communist movements, the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia destroyed all of the Arab nationalist movements. Ironically, there was a kind of proxy war backed by the US between Saudi Arabia and Egypt under Nasser in Yemen. So Yemen has been a big part of this for a long time. During the first Cold War, Yemen was divided between North and South, which basically it is again today, almost on the exact same boundaries. And South Yemen had a Marxist government that was very close to the Soviet Union. And the US and Saudi Arabia were trying to use the northern part of Yemen to wage a proxy war against the Arab nationalist movements, especially Nasser's Egypt. So what we saw is that the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia destroyed all of the Arab nationalist movements. The overthrow of the Syrian government was basically the end of Arab nationalism as a force that had state power. The Iraqi Ba'athist government was destroyed by the US in the invasion of 2003. Syria's Ba'athist government has been overthrown. Libya, Gaddafi was also a revolutionary Arab nationalist. His government was destroyed. So now that the US and Israel destroyed all of the communist movements and all of the Arab nationalist movements, now they're going after all of the Islamic-oriented nationalist resistance movements. And like I said, I think the best way to understand movements like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Ansar Allah in Yemen or the PMFs, the Hashid forces in Iraq, which is called the Islamic Resistance of Iraq. All of these movements are basically, you can think of them as a combination of kind of third world nationalist movements and liberation Shia Islam. And now these are the largest, most powerful resistance groups in the region. And the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia are committed once again to destroying all of the resistance, making sure that the region can be entirely dominated by US imperialism. And we see that most of the regimes in the region are a bunch of puppet regimes controlled by the US. Jordan being the greatest example. The Jordanian monarchy is a joke. I mean, people in Jordan joke that the king of Jordan speaks Arabic with an English accent because English is his first language. I mean, he's definition of a puppet. And when Iran responded to Israeli attacks against sovereign Iranian territory, including its consulate in Syria, in an act of self-defense that was in accordance with international law, the Jordanian regime intercepted or tried to intercept Iranian rockets and missiles to protect Israel. So this is the situation we're dealing with. Yemen and Iran at this point are the only states that are actually resisting Israel's genocide in the region. There are resistance movements in Lebanon, but they don't have state power. There are resistance movements in Iraq, of course, they don't have state power. And then, of course, there's the Palestinians who don't have a state because the U.S. has prevented them from having a state. So now we see the continuation of this, where the U.S. is trying to destroy the Yemeni resistance. So this is not a new project, of course. I already talked about how throughout the past several decades, the war on all of the anti-imperialist resistance movements in West Asia has continued and has changed in different ways as the movements have evolved. But Yemen is an example of how you don't need to be the richest country in the region. You can stand up and fight to try to stop genocide and resist colonialism. And that's why Ansar Allah, this movement in Yemen, has actually now become very popular all across the Arab majority world, all across West Asia. Many people have been praising them because they see them as standing up against imperialism, standing up against Israel's genocide. And again, it's so symbolic, the fact that they're the poorest country in the region. It shows, and the fact they don't have the most advanced military technology, they're making these very cheap drones. And yes, Iran is helping them. They don't dispute that, but they're not Iranian proxies. They're allies of Iran. And why do they have all of these weapons? Well, I already mentioned that some of them, they're making their own drones for very small amounts of money. And then Israel is spending millions of dollars through its Iron Dome system and other weapons that were provided by the U.S. So the U.S. military-industrial complex benefits and it enriches itself, and Israel's spending all of this money. And by the way, you know who backs Israeli bonds? The U.S. government. So Israel goes further and further into debt to pay for all of these weapons from the U.S. by selling bonds, which are sold on Wall Street and backed by U.S. banks. And the U.S. government has said that if Israel defaults on its bonds, the U.S. government will make sure that the bondholders are made whole. that the U.S. will make sure that they're paid. So again, Israel is an extension of the U.S. empire. None of this, without U.S. support, Israel could not do any of this. This was even admitted by Israeli military officials in an article in Haaretz. They said if the U.S. withdrew support, this war, the genocidal war in Gaza, would end within 2 weeks. I would say within one day. And finally, the point I was going to say a second ago about where these weapons came from in Yemen. Yes, Iran has supported the Yemeni resistance, but a lot of these weapons came from the Yemeni military, because I already mentioned that the people of Yemen had a revolution, the September Revolution in 2014. And what happened? A lot of parts of the Yemeni military joined the revolution and joined Ansar Allah. And one of the reasons that there's this propaganda term of calling them the Houthis is because this is why the U.S. and the Saudi regime and the UAE, they're trying to, and Israel, they're trying to portray this mass movement in Yemen that has created a government as if it were one family or one tribe. The Houthis refers to a family and brothers who created originally the movement, but there are many millions of people involved in this movement. It's not just the Houthi family or tribe, but because this is the propaganda term used, they're saying that this family or this tribe of the Houthis are Iranian proxies. They've taken control of Yemen, ignoring the fact that in the northern part of Yemen, where the majority of the population lives, they've created a government that includes other political parties. They've created a political council that has representatives from different political factions in Yemen, including, by the way, there are Nasserists and Arab nationalists, and even there's a small socialist party in Yemen that are supportive of this coalition government. It's a revolutionary coalition government in Yemen. And they have these weapons because a lot of people in the Yemeni military joined them. So They don't need to get all of their weapons from Iran. This idea of them being Iranian proxies is, again, just propaganda.